Fiction is the lie through which we tell the truth. Albert Camus. You're listening to AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Shymanski. Albert Camus was an early 20th century French-Algerian philosopher who's well known for popularizing the myth of Sisyphus, an allegorical story where a man condemned to pushing a boulder off a rock for the rest of his life, only to have it roll back down every time he reaches the top, comes to terms with his situation and learns to accept the absurdity of life and tackle it head on. That's a fictional story that espouses a truth, that life is absurd in so many ways and that the best way to proceed is to accept it with open arms. Camus' famous essay about the myth was over 150 pages long. In using just 10 words, the Camus quote that I read at the top of this segment explains why the myth of Sisyphus moves us. Because fiction is the lie through which we tell the truth. Anybody who knows and reads fictional stories knows well that you can be genuinely moved by fake stories and fake people in a way that mirrors reality so well that it doesn't matter that the characters aren't real. Not everybody's as evangelical about fiction as I am, though. Now, with the most pretentious intro I've ever written out of the way, let's bring in today's guests, who we're super happy to have on the show again. Both work for the Center for Equitable Library Access, otherwise known as CELA. Theresa Power is an access librarian at CELA, and Karen McKay is the communications manager. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having us.
Hello.
All I'm trying to say with that intro is that you can learn and be moved by fiction just as much as nonfic. And the reason I felt the need to say that is because there's a recent trend of people who seemingly exclusively read nonfic. And I felt the need to defend fiction. Karen, what exactly prompted this conversation?
Well, a couple things, actually. They kind of converged at the same time. So there was a GQ article that came out in, I believe it was early August. And it was just an essay on why men don't read and why men don't read fiction in particular. And so I was chatting with some friends sitting around the dock at the cottage. My husband and my 20-year-old son was there. And then we had some neighbors over. We were just talking about reading in general. And the men all sort of said that they don't read fiction in general. And the women said that they do read fiction. And I actually tend to skew towards memoir in my reading if I sort of have the choice. And I'm always kind of, sounds odd to say, but I'm always kind of pleasantly surprised when I have a fiction book that I read that I really sort of fall in love with. And so we were just talking a little bit about, reading choices and whether they split along gender lines or education lines or, what causes us to be drawn to the books that we're drawn to. And so I thought it'd be an interesting thing to be talking about with this group.
Yeah, I've seen some articles along those lines too, where it was one man saying, I'm tired of people judging me for not reading. I think what's more interesting is people staying away from nonfiction specifically. And I remember seeing another couple of stats of big high-level business leaders, like Warren Buffett and Elon Musk and stuff like that, talking about like the books they read and book recommendations. And so often they feature very few fiction books. Bill Gates, over the past 7 years, recommended 97 books. Only 9 of them were fiction. And I think it shows a trend that I think I'm going to take a crack at this and explain why nonfiction is so much more attractive to people, and that's that it's a lot easier to explain the value of them and like the intellectual pursuit of reading that's associated with them. Where if you're going to read a book about, say, Russian history, you're going to learn about Russian history, right? If you want to learn about business, you're going to read a book about business and you're going to learn about business. There's a simple one-to-one relationship, and therefore it's easy to convince yourself that reading books are good for you. And books take a lot of time, and you just can't commit. If you're going to commit that time I think a lot of people would prefer doing it to something that's perceived as being like a better use of your time and more pragmatic, right? Teresa, what do you think?
I read both fiction and nonfiction, and I think no matter what you read, you're always learning something. And, whether it is fiction or nonfiction, it's just that you're choosing a different avenue of learning. So, like a fiction book can say stuff to you about, relationships, for example, and speak to you as a person in a very particular way. But, I think like a nonfiction book can also do that if we kind of step away and think about like why we would enjoy a particular book in general, less about like the genre, like a mystery versus a biography, and more about like what the approach might be to talking about a particular person, for example, or the setting that it's in.
Well, what's complicated is now we're getting into like the personal preferences, and you can't hold it against someone for having personal preferences. Mm-hmm. That's why I want to be careful with this conversation. Like, I don't want to tell these people that exclusively read nonfiction that they're wrong, because they're not. Personally, I think that they're missing out, because when you're reading fiction, you're being presented, yes, fictional stories, and fake people, but they represent and enact stories that mirror real life in a way that sometimes feels more real and more accessible than reading about stories that happened in real life. Because when we're reading a nonfiction that's retelling stories that actually happened, one thing we know well is that humans don't exactly have the best recollection, and we have biases, and it doesn't exactly it doesn't make for the most convincing stories when you consider all the biases that we hold. And when you're telling a fictional story, you can more accurately and represent different perspectives and human dilemmas in a way that doesn't factor in as many biases. And that's why I think that telling allegorical stories is really, really powerful. And something I saw recently was in the Harvard Review, which is a publication. They were talking about how there were certain businesses where, as a sort of like workplace exercise, they brought in somebody to hold basically like a book club where they would read short stories. And those short stories were meant to be a sort of lesson about leadership and teamwork and that type of thing. And it was shown that it was very effective in spawning good, healthy, productive conversations on topics that would otherwise be very difficult, like topics of failure in leadership and that type of thing. And it was really helpful in a business setting. Karen, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how this group of people that seemingly don't read fiction, they heavily tend to skew male. Do we have any idea why that might be?
Well, again, like we don't want to generalize too much, but there are some indicators that suggest that men read more nonfiction or read in other categories other than fiction predominantly. And so there's a few things about that. Deloitte actually did a study on why boys don't read and what what sort of the cause of the gender gap in reading is. And the conclusions were interesting. So one of the things that they said with a challenge with that kind of situation is that if female characters, let me back up a little bit. So the study they did showed that 10% or 10 of the best-selling male authors, their readership was pretty much evenly distributed by gender. So 55% of their readers were male and 45% were female. Versus if it was a female author, only 19% of the female authors' readers were male.
Wow.
And so, and this was in the fiction category, I believe. And so this is sort of an interesting thing to think about, in that publishing is right now predominantly dominated by women. There's obviously men playing significant roles in the publishing industry, but it sparks the question of, are we reading, are the books that we're being presented and the books that are being marketed to us as a culture, are they predominantly influenced by feminine publishing executives? And is that part of why there's not the interest for men to read them? The flip side of that conversation is that if men are only reading male authors and not reading female authors, they're only getting the perspective on female characters through the male lens. And so that can sort of reinforce a lack of understanding and perhaps underrepresentation of other non-male groups. And so, it goes back to what's available to read and how is it presented to us, to male and female readers, or just in general, how is it presented to us? And what are the topics that are being delved into? And so one of the things that we chatted about a little bit was the self-help genre, and that men tend to read informational books, women tend to read fiction books, that a lot of the self-help is aimed at women getting, becoming better in whatever sort of category the book happens to be in. And so I just wonder if men aren't seeing books for themselves that they want to read, just perhaps because of the way it's marketed, or perhaps because of the way that it's, that in our culture, reading is sort of more seen as a feminine female thing to do. That, it goes back to childhood, and when young kids are asked if they like reading, close to 50% of girls say yes, and much lower number, only about a quarter of boys say that reading is one of their favorite hobbies. So I think we need to look way back, and to also look broadly at our culture in terms of, what are we presenting to folks, and how are we talking about story, and how are we talking about the value of story to different genders.
So how is the publishing industry female dominated? Do you want to elaborate on that?
Oh, yes. I had read some stats. Theresa might be able to help me out with this a little bit. But just in terms of the number of editors, of authors who are winning, some of the major prizes, it's really, there's been a swing in the last, say, 40-ish years, I believe the numbers were, that, there used to be more male publishing employees that were making the decisions, more male editors, and that tends to have swung towards women. And the other thing that was identified as sort of a potential issue is that most English teachers are women, and so their choices of books or the ways that they approach teaching them may not, especially fiction books, may not sort of resonate with young men. It's cool for young guys to not read, to be gamers, to be, reading stuff that's going to help their future versus quote unquote sort of wasting time on stories.
And I hate that attitude of thinking that reading fiction is a waste of time, and you have to be hyper pragmatic and you have to constantly be reading. I remember, was it Mark Cuban that said that he reads 3 hours a day, which seems excessive, but he does it as like an intellectual exercise, right? And I'm wondering if this story of, or like this culture of seeing as reading books as like this thing well-adjusted humans do, and almost as like an intellectual flex, where you talk about how many books you read and how much book, like how many hours of audiobooks do you listen to, how many pages you read per day, and when you go on Goodreads, like how many books are in your read shelf, that type of thing, reading goals. It kind of takes away from the leisure aspect of reading and turns it into a chore, which I think is kind of harmful in the long run. Theresa, have you kind of noticed that type of reading as a flex culture?
I actually haven't.
No.
Maybe I should have.
Maybe it's because I'm chronically online.
Yeah, I dabbled a bit in Goodreads, to be quite honest with you, but for a lot of reasons, I can't post what I'm actually reading. So, like, most of what I'm reading is to be reviewed for awards and reading programs. So, I can't really say what those are. So, like Goodreads and tracking kind of becomes a bit irrelevant to me. Certainly, like, personally, like my like amongst people I know and friends, haven't really flexed like that either. But speaking to someone who like reads a lot, I can definitely say like flexing like that would definitely make it feel like a chore.
Yeah, it definitely would. And okay, humor me here, and like, let's assume that this theory does have some truth to it. I feel like the reason why fiction would not really work as a flex is because people will see it as like a leisure activity. And if you're spending all of this time being leisurely, then it's like, how is that a flex? How does that reflect on you? But to be clear, I still think that reading fiction is hugely beneficial for a number of ways. And you touched on it earlier, Theresa. That's how you're presenting emotion and things that you otherwise would not see in a nonfiction story. Do you either of you want to take a stab at the way the differences between these two categories are marketed?
I think for better or worse, as someone who does the purchasing of the books, I definitely see a difference in the way that book covers are put together, especially like romance, rom-com, especially the contemporary romance book covers as well. I personally find them very appealing, I have to say. They can be quite like bubbly, almost cartoonish, sometimes a bit like non-specific and descriptive in the way that they're, the way like people are on it, a very colorful, almost like, I want to say like wispy sometimes in the way that the fonting is done, but it's definitely like it's very, very specific. Whoever picks up that book, I mean, that's great, but it's definitely put together, those book covers, in a very specific way. And when I think of like nonfiction books, I think of like nonfiction books always have a very long title. They always have a very long subtitle. To really like explain what the book is about, so it's like, it's very clear, like what you're kind of getting into and the subject. And I would also say that nonfiction books tend to use a lot of like actual pictures, like actual photography. And in my brain are also often very like dark. The colors tend to be like a bit on the darker side, and they're probably thinking, okay, well, like darker in people's brains signals like seriousness as well. So maybe making the person think more serious about that particular book. So those are like, I'd say like two of the main differences I would see between like fiction and nonfiction.
Karen, have you noticed any differences in the way these two genres are presented?
Yeah, quite a sort of stark difference. So I was just looking at the 10 best nonfiction books of 2023 as put out by Time, and they are books that have heft to them, and they are books that deal with big problems. There's one of them was poverty in America, one of them is about climate change. One of them was the Doppelganger book. Just ones that have that they require a lot of intellectual commitment, and so I think that that's why sometimes we, as a culture, might sort of give a bit more value to that than to a story, which almost always fundamentally comes down in one way or another to a relationship, whether that's a relationship with other people, with family, with yourself, with with nature, or with an idea. Fiction books are about fundamentally relationships. And just to go back to that idea about, men versus women, there's well-known research that women sort of are more relationship focused, and men tend to be more focused on other types of things. And so I wonder if that plays into it a little bit. There's lots of studies that talk about why fiction is so important, that it helps develop empathy, that it helps develop critical thinking. One of the articles that I read in preparing for this talked about the fact that fiction requires sort of a mental discipline, and you need to continue to come back to the narrative and follow it throughout the book. Whereas nonfiction books, you can probably get 1/10 of the content from a nonfiction book by reading 1/10 of the book. But if you read 1/10 of a fiction book, you're missing the lessons. The fiction book sort of has to be consumed as a whole in order to get everything out of it. Whereas, you can read just for information in a nonfiction book. And so I thought that idea was interesting as well, especially in a culture where we're pushed to achieve things and to cross things off our list, and to, do those sorts of activities that have external value versus maybe some having a little bit more internal value.
I feel that because if you read like 1/10 of a nonfiction book, you could get pretty much the message of an entire nonfiction book, which is something that I hear a lot. It's a common complaint that I hear of nonfiction books, is that what they'll often do is they'll have like 1 or 2, maybe 3 central ideas that are fairly simplistic, but they will take pages and pages and hours to re-illustrate and to recontextualize these ideas, just to really hammer it home. But I think what I'm talking about here specifically is more the self-help genre, which is a huge part of the nonfiction, the larger genre of nonfiction. And Theresa, do you want to tell us a bit more about how huge the self-help genre is?
Sure. So I was interested in your comment about self-help being, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe being a little bit cringy. And I think people have a very particular, I think people have a very particular idea of what we mean by self-help. And so I was looking into it a little bit more, and I thought it was very interesting that there's a huge amount of money in the nonfiction publishing world. It's projected to be over $14 billion. This was like a number for 2022. And then projected by 2026 to reach over $16 billion in publication. And in 2022, and this is the US number, keep in mind, nonfiction books actually accounted for almost 50% of book sales in the US. So 45.5% of book sales. So that's almost half, which is really incredible. And also just for like our audiobook listeners as well, in 2022, 1 in 5 books sold for like nonfiction in general were actually in audiobooks. But but I think what's interesting about self-help is that, well, we may have a very particular idea of what self-help might be, which is, how do I get out of, or how do I feel better about a bad relationship or a breakup? There's actually a lot of different categories of self-help. Some that I found really interesting were like indigenous health and mental health, healing, green lifestyle, communication, social skills as well. So I think that there's a lot out there for people under that self-help genre.
Right. Self-help is a hugely diverse genre in and of its own, right? Because you can help yourself in all sorts of ways. Like is a cookbook a self-help book? Because you're helping yourself and learning how to cook, right? I mean, it's all kind of vague, but you did forward me a giant list of like 59 subcategories of self-help. I'm not going to go through them, but you can just think about those huge yellow books back in the day, the X for Dummies type books. That's what I think about when I think about self-help. I want to thank both of you so much for coming back on the show. I feel like there's so much we didn't touch on, but it's always like that with you guys. Karen, Theresa, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
That was Karen McKay and Theresa Power of the Center for Equitable Library Access. Karen is the communications manager and Theresa is the access librarian at CELA. That's all the time we have for this AMI audiobook review segment. If you missed any of our conversation, you can find a repeat of AMI Today on AMI Audio every 8 hours. The show is also available on your favorite podcast platforms. Plus, you can watch the program shortly after the show ends on YouTube. Thanks for joining us on AMI Today. I'm your host, Jacob Shymanski. Thanks for listening.